All right, let's look at women's politics. Hopefully my thing. Okay, good. I'm gonna go through a little bit of PowerPoint, try and make some broader points that are in some of the readings that'll hopefully help on the exam. And then I'm also going to do a briefer video that focuses on some of the more complicated points or questions in the exam, or that you'll have to deal with. I hope you've enjoyed the semester and reading about some of the stuff, and I hope my particular readings that I've chosen and particular way I maybe see some things, well, maybe it's come on a little thick. I hope that it hasn't made anybody feel too uncomfortable or something, or that people feel, well, in the classroom you don't have a right not to feel uncomfortable, but you should feel safe to speak your mind to an extent. No hate words. But academic discourse and disagreement and such is good. And so I hope maybe I've challenged some people, but I hope in challenging people, everyone has either been like, I don't care, I'm just putting my head down and trying to get through the semester, or hasn't felt unsafe to speak up. I enjoy challenges in the class, and I can be wrong or overlook something. So, yeah. Anyway, women in politics, I'll go through some stuff. And yeah, so there are two things I want to mention at the very outset, and I'll go into a little more detail in the next video. Specifically, study guide is specifically on a study guide review is framing and the white male gaze. They're both there's some connection between the two. So framing, when we talk about framing, we're talking about the way an issue is presented, the way a question is asked, the perspective from which something is considered. Now, when something is considered, or the perspective that something is considered from, comes from, will very often determine where the burden of proof is on that issue, or which side needs to be on the defensive or be on the offensive in terms of making their point. So let's see. The recent Supreme Court case about Hobby Lobby, you can ask, should Hobby Lobby be forced to provide contraception to their employees? Or you can ask, does Hobby Lobby have the right to deny contraception to their employees? Or, it's another way to phrase that last one. Do Hobby Lobby employees have a religious right to decide if contraception should be covered in their healthcare plans, something like that. The first example versus the last two examples I gave, hopefully you can see how asking the question one way or the other can lead to different answers, can lead to different assumptions about what is right, or what is inherently the right position, or inherently maybe the position that we'll take, and what is the position that needs defending. We talked about it very early on in the semester with regards to framing in the media, and even I gave the example of framing the question, which people maybe weren't exposed to as much, or didn't. Maybe it's something with my background would only understand. The framing of the question about the media's liberalness or conservativeness. The question is asked: is the media liberal? Well, if you're asked that question, you're forced to defend either the media is not liberal and prove that the media is not liberal, or you defend or prove that the media is liberal. What it sort of leaves out is the ability to advocate for the position that the media is conservative. Example framing, now apply that to this Hobby Lobby case. Are we going to focus on whether or not Hobby Lobby has religious rights to deny contraception, or are we going to focus on the rights of women to have access to contraception? And depending on how we look at that question can bias us to come to different conclusions, answers, and that's what framing is. Now, the white male gaze is a form of framing. It's this idea that we look through all the issues in society with this sort of white male lens. That things that white males, and in particular upper class white males, consider to be important, consider to be issues that affect their lives, are the norm, are the issues that affect everyone's life, and therefore are the natural kind of issues that we should look at, the important issues. Everything else becomes a special interest. Everything else becomes a uphill battle for people that want to make their issue something to put on the policy agenda, to make it something that should be considered. It becomes an uphill battle for them because it's not considered a natural or legitimate issue or point of view. I give the example of the stock market. White upper class males have most of their wealth in the stock market. So when they look at policies, look at if the economy is doing well, you'll often see them looking at the performance of the stock market. The vast majority of Americans may have a little bit of money in the stock market, but not a lot of their money in the stock market. They won't be as concerned or as affected by the rise and fall of the stock market. However, what gets the most play, what is seen as the most important indicator of the health of the economy, if the economy is rebounding, is it the stock market, or is it things like wages for the average American, or unemployment, things like that, it's often the stock market. So we have seen a lot of talk recently about how the economy really is kind of roaring right now. It's just people don't know it. And the way we know it's roaring, it's going great, is because the stock market is up something on the order of 130% since its lowest point, maybe 140% since its lowest point, and it's the highest it's ever been in the history of the country. There are lots of people making money hand over fist, and while some attention is paid to the fact that wages have not increased since the 2000s in general, who cares? The stock market is doing great. The rest will inevitably follow, even though that's not inevitably the case. And whenever you bring up or talk about the issue of race or gender and pay in race and gender wealth or inequality, or how certain policies that were created largely by upper class white men, how those policies may disproportionately burden non-white upper class men, you get attacked, or you get labeled somebody who is only concerned with special interest issues, who is playing the race card, or is making something out of nothing, things like that. That's framing. That's the white male lens. We'll talk about later, and we'll talk about why representation matters. I'm looking at my notes here. Okay. Go through some of these slides and then talk a little bit about some of the readings as they come up. Let's see. Oh, important thing about racism and sexism. Think of it, so remember systemic power. It's the idea is the power that the elites have in an urban setting is not necessarily something that needs to be expressed, needs to be exercised overtly, said, if you don't do this, I'm leaving. It's something that is innate, that just sort of happens, that city officials just sort of anticipate what the elite want and try and bend city policies to satisfy them, because the elite have things that the city want. In that same vein, kind of, when we talk about racism and sexism, we're talking about power in society and in institutions. We're not talking about personal bigotry and personal actions. And in that way, women cannot be sexist, and everybody that is not white cannot be racist, if that makes sense. Only white people can be racist. Black people cannot be racist. Hispanic people cannot be racist. Or Hispanic black people, I guess, cannot be racist. Chinese people cannot be racist. And here's the reason. When we're talking about individual people and their actions, generally we're looking at things like bigotry and prejudice. A black person certainly can be bigoted and prejudiced towards any manner of people. Towards everybody else, as a matter of fact. Just like white people can be bigoted or racist, or anybody, or bigoted or prejudiced, anybody else. The difference is that with white people, there comes innate, inherent social power that causes that individual bigotry and prejudice to reverberate throughout the systems of power in the society that have real effects in keeping people down. So, as a white man, a woman can run up to me and say, "I hate you. You're a man. I'm so bigoted against you." Sorry. That made me laugh. The absurdity of somebody running up to somebody else and saying they're bigoted against you. Anyway, ultimately, who gives a shit? Crap. Who gives a crap? If that happens, that's not going to affect me in the long run. That's not going to matter. I'm a man, and as a man, I have certain access to institutions that give me this advantage, that sort of provide me abilities, powers. I don't want to start making it seem like I have superpowers or something, that other people, or that women in this case, if I'm speaking as a man, don't have access to. And we'll see some of that in the examples from Delusions of Gender, how that works. And as a white person, okay, I'm a white person, I'm bigoted against black people. Okay? Here's why that becomes racism, and why I can be racist and a black person, even if bigoted against a white person, cannot be racist. And this doesn't hold true. I mean, this example won't hold true 100% of the time, but it's more, it's very, very, likely. I'm pissed off at my black neighbor for being black, let's say. I don't know. I have this bigotry. I find any little infraction. This black neighbor is working on their car and is playing the music in their car and playing it loud. Something that I've done lots and lots of times. And I'm sure most people within 4 houses of me can hear it. I call the police and I'm like, "Yo, police. My next door neighbor is playing music very loud and it's very disruptive." The police are going to come out. I'm the white guy complaining. The other person's the black guy playing their music loud. More than likely, that black person will be treated differently than I would be treated if the complaint was reversed. The black person would be more likely to have a difficult time with the police. The black person would be more likely to get some sort of ticket, public nuisance ticket or fine or something like that, than I would get if the complaint had been reversed. And that's why we talk about in political science, like, how racism and sexism exist in this more kind of academic situation where we need power to be within the framework for somebody to be racist and sexist. Now, in everyday language, often, like on the news, you'll see things like, Obama is a racist against white people. In that case, what they're really talking about, or what they're meaning, is he's bigoted against white people. But in a real sense, even though Obama's the president, Obama would have a difficult time having the definition of a racist applied to him because of these extra things that it needs. Otherwise, and part of the reason racism and sexism are defined this way is one, it needs to be a little more than just bigotry, because a lot of people can have some sort of bigotedness about them, but we don't want the we want to be speaking about, when we're talking about racism, it's kind of a big deal, and we want to be speaking about something very specific that's well defined, that has boundaries, that means something. And if we expand this idea of racism and somebody being racist to anyone that has any kind of prejudice against another race, or sexism, anybody who has prejudice against somebody of the opposite sex or against their own sex, it becomes very hard to figure out what you're talking about. The meanings get stretched so much that they become meaningless, and so that's why we narrow some of these things. Anyway, so feminism is kind of a big deal when we're talking about women's in politics. The history of feminism, what it means today. Rush Limbaugh likes to talk about feminists as being feminazis. Sometimes people will say feminists want to convert women to lesbians and make all women become lesbians and convert children to paganism. Feminists were the reason 9/11 happened, according to Jerry Falwell, I believe it was, which is fun. Didn't know as a feminist I had that kind of power, but I'm happy to wield it. Next time, though, I'll direct it away from the worst terrorist attack in American history towards maybe something positive. But sorry about that, everybody. Okay, so what are feminists worried about? First, feminism is and when, by extension, what are we talking about with women in politics? What are we worried about? What are we talking about? It can vary widely, okay? So, feminism, speaking of feminism itself, can be as narrow as making sure women have the right to vote, have the right to not be beaten by their husbands, to something sort of what we might today consider just far on the other end of the spectrum in terms of rights, as ensuring that the accident that women are born with a particular set of genitalia does not cause them extra burdens in our society. Okay? It does not limit their opportunities to be participants in social and economic activity in civil society. So, in doing so, we're looking at this idea of when we're looking at gender politics, of women's politics, of what fairness and what justice looks like within these things, and what role society has. So, what role does society have, and by extension kind of does government have, in addressing the inequalities that can be created simply by the accident of the sex of someone's birth, right? Women are born with increased sort of burdens placed on them. They have extra healthcare costs because of menstruation, because of the gynecological exams that they need to go through to, and the extra invasiveness that involves, that they need to go through once a year. I think maybe a recommendation recently came down to make it like twice a year. Once every 2 years or something. But men, if we are being tested, or if we're being checked out, it's a glove and a simple, feel of the testicles to see if there's cancer, and a eye check exam. It can be done in like 10 seconds or less, and it can be part of an everyday or a regular physical, whereas women need like stirrups and stuff. I've never had an exam, so I don't know all the particulars that go on, but I hear it can be cold and slightly uncomfortable depending on the person doing the exam. So that costs different money, okay? Women can get pregnant, which causes them some things that cannot be avoided, such as physical discomfort, pain, things like that during the pregnancy, morning sickness, etc. There's just a lot of work involved in simply getting through a pregnancy that, unfortunately, society can't really prevent a woman from going through that. However, society can enact rules and create and form attitudes that make it so that women aren't punished for having children, that women aren't looked upon differently if they have a children or if they don't have a children. And when we talk about sexism in society, we often talk about a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. So a woman who doesn't have a child, what are you doing? You're selfish. You're somehow missing out on something in life. You obviously are missing some sort of empathy or nurturing aspect. You may be more likely to be perceived as, forgive the language, a cold, frigid bitch or something like that. Whereas if you do have a child, oh, that's sweet, of course you can never work because you have a child and you have to take care of the child, and people will be less likely to hire you because you have a child, and you may have more absenteeism because children get sick and you'll need to pick them up from school and all this stuff. So now you can't get a job if you have a child, but if you don't have a child, people will look at you badly. So that sucks for women. But what the range of feminism we're looking at, and the range of sort of of the issues that are at question in women's politics today is how much social responsibility is there to correct the disadvantages maybe that are created by whether or not you have a 2X chromosomes or not. There's also other parts of it, with regards to controlling women's sexuality, looking at women with distrust and things like that, which we'll also talk about. But think of that as kind of an outline for a lot of the political questions that you see and hear about in today's society, like equal pay for equal work, paid maternity leave, not being punished because you have a child, having daycare on company property, things like that. Let's see, contraception care. It's another big one. Okay, so this is important for the exam and for life in general. You'll maybe also hear the word patriarchy thrown around. We live in a patriarchal society. Patriarchy is a thing that exists and it keeps women down. What is patriarchy? Patriarchy simply means that men hold power in important social institutions, and they have access to that power in important social institutions. It doesn't mean that women are powerless or that women don't hold power in some social institutions, but it means that overwhelmingly men have access to power in the social institutions and political institutions that matter for making decisions in society. That men's views are the ones that are taken more seriously, that women don't have a seat at the table, or if for every one seat at the table a woman has, 100 men have a seat at the table, so they're often drowned out. Think of a good example. So when we look at women in power today, I give some examples on the slides here. You know, of the Fortune 500 companies, women aren't excluded from Fortune 500 companies, but there's 23 of the 500 that have women CEOs. Women aren't excluded from the highest paying executive jobs in the Fortune 500 companies, but there's 8% of those spots are held by women. Women have access to those important parts of power. However, they don't have very good access to it. In Delusions of Gender and other parts of the book, I don't think they talk about it in the Glass Workplace. But there's talk about historically and today a lot of business decisions taking place on golf courses and in strip clubs, and a lot of bonding between executives that lead to business deals happening in strip clubs and in golf courses, and how women are specifically excluded from some golf courses and strip clubs are places where women aren't exactly welcome or meant to feel welcome or feel very safe, and lots of times it's gotten to the point where men will hold business meetings at strip clubs as a means to explicitly exclude women from those meetings. So yeah. I might skip around. Okay, so historical context with regards to women and with regards to marriage. So we talked about how before there was this clear hierarchy, patriarchy, men are above women. However, over time we developed this nice, supposedly equaler-ish separate spheres ideology where men and women were not above or below each other. They just held separate roles in society. Women did domestic chores, things like that. Men were the head of the household. However, in reality, it was this relationship still, where the men were above women, right? This was seen in Bradwell v. Illinois, where Justice Bradley said Ms. Bradwell could not be a lawyer in Illinois because, I mean, come on. Men can be lawyers because they're aggressive, and women can't because they're timid. And he talked about how women have come out of the home and become teachers and stuff. Not explicitly, but that's what he's referring to when he's talking about women having the opportunity to make wages outside of the home. And that's great, he says, but it fits in with their specific sphere of where they fit in the social order. Nurturing, family growing, things like that. Historically also, during this time and before and up until the 1970s, when a man and woman were married, a woman would become invisible under the law. So a man was the only legal entity. A woman was no longer something that existed in the eyes of the law, except in some extreme cases, maybe involving like treason or something. Women couldn't enter into contracts, couldn't, if a woman committed some types of crime or offense, it was sometimes the man that had to answer for it. If the woman went out and made any money, it wasn't her money, it was the man's money. There were laws that said that the man had to provide his wife with some basic necessities, but nothing more than that, that he controlled all the finances in the house. As such, this is where the idea that a man could beat his wife came from, that a man being the head of the household and thus to some degree being responsible for a woman's behavior could apply what was referred to in the law of sex discrimination, appropriate corrective measures. That slowly began to change, and then even in the reading where that came from, the mid 1700s, they're talking about how that was something that wasn't really allowed anymore or socially acceptable. In some places was illegal. And that was nice, and we had a gentler age, they said. 1769 was when that article was written. So going back real quick to the separate spheres ideology, now that we've covered some of the being legally invisible and beatings. Separate spheres ideology, a very important part of that is, even though it purported to make things more equal between men and women, it was in reality another form of oppression and designed to subjugate women. However, because it offered women a legitimate reason to be outside of the home and actually interact with other women in a economic sense, like in the workplace, it offered an opportunity for liberation, because now women, they would be together teaching at a schoolhouse, and they would get to talking together and whatever the equivalent of a teacher's lounge might be, and they would say, hey, by the way, I wish I had the right to vote. Oh, you wish you had the right to vote? I wish I had the right to vote too. Let's do something about that. And it allowed for this organization, it allowed for the push to a lot of these gains that women made later on. Great news, right? So that's how the separate spheres ideology was both a system of oppression. It limited women's access to jobs in society, further reinforced sex stereotypes about where women should be and shouldn't be in society. But it also allowed women to interact with each other and to create organizations that eventually led to the women's liberation movement and things like the right to vote and such. Now with the separate spheres ideology, we have this idea that women can enter the workforce. It's important to note, though, that women have always worked. We can look at it in a very narrow sense, in the sense that raising children and running a household is work, and that's something women have done. However, that's a very, again, upper class white point of view to look at it in terms of women always having worked and how they've always worked. The fact is, this idea that we have in our mind that men would go out and do money stuff, work, and women would stay home and take care of the kids and whatever, that history we have is a upper class white male lens through which to see history. The reality is, if you weren't upper class and white, more than likely you had a different life, and both men and women were in some degree working outside of the home because you needed to do that to survive. It wasn't maybe as prevalent, women in the workforce wasn't as prevalent as it is today, where women actually, I think, now make up a majority of the workforce. And it makes sense that they would, because they're a majority of the population. But it was a lot more prevalent than we think it was. And if you're not white and you're a woman, you work at a much greater rate than if you are white and a woman, because on top of the middle class issues that white families faced, which meant that a number of women had to go out and also work in some degree or another. Now all of a sudden you're in the 1880s and poor and black, and the man can't work enough, or can work but can't earn enough because of the color of his skin, and the woman just always has to work also. And basically throughout American history, black women have worked always and forever. Or have had some sort of paid income. So this idea that women want the right to enter the workforce and so they got this ability to enter in the workforce is very much from one perspective, from one idea, and that's a little bit of how that framing comes into view or comes into place. So if we look at the pay gap today between men and women, some of that is historical. So what do I mean by that? I mean the jobs that women were allowed to have under separate spheres, like nursing, secretary work, education, they got paid less because they were women working there. And that historical tradition set the market for what those people are considered worthy to be paid today. If men were in those jobs, today the teachers, secretaries, nurses would be paid a lot more than they are actually paid today, because the free market isn't necessarily really determining these wages. It's institutional sexism that's determining these wages, and the legacy of specific intentional sexism back in the day, the legacy that we're left with, and things that we can get away with. I think very few people believe teachers to be paid at a fair market wage or to be overpaid. I think most people see teachers to be vastly underpaid. But it would cost money to pay them more than we pay them now, and we've been given this sort of historical tradition of teachers not being paid that much, so we can justify still not paying them very much because they already don't get paid very much, if that makes sense. It's not like we're decreasing somebody's salary. It's just that we've never increased it. I hope that point makes sense. Okay, so there's this other deal with employment and poverty and women working. It's the feminization of poverty. The law of sex discrimination talks about it. I really like, though, the delusions of gender and the discussion that goes on there with regards to it. Let's see. And in delusions of gender, this is something you should definitely familiarize yourself with. The different studies that have gone on that look at the way women applicants are viewed for specific jobs, or viewed for any job, really. So, talked about one study where 2 women have the exact same application except one's a mother. The mother was much less likely to get the job. And the reason she was much less likely to get the job, actually, a lot of people said, had to do with the fact that she was a mother. She might be out more, she might be less committed to having a career because she made the choice to be a mother. And being a mother gets you paid less because if you're a mother, then you're considered to take the job less seriously. Things like that. Well, and the thing that's even more important about that is being a father does not lead to those same conclusions, does not lead to that same difference of opinion in the commitment to the job, and does not lead to the same wage discrimination. So, let's see. Where is it? Okay. One of the passages here, using the cover story that a startup communications company was looking for a head of its marketing department, sociologist Shelley Correll, Correll, yeah, and a colleague found that compared with paper non-mothers, meaning they showed the exact resume to experts or to people in the field as to who they would hire, but they weren't real applicants, but they would determine whatever. Compared with paper non-mothers, identical paper mother applicants were rated about 10% less competent, 15% less committed to the workplace, and worthy of $11,000 less in salary. Moreover, only 47% of mothers, compared with 84% of non-mothers, were recommended for hire. So, what this survey or what this study showed and what this means is that a group of people in the field of hiring for this particular job. There are lots of jobs that are there's lots of head of marketing departments out there, right? People that hire for the heads of marketing departments that are experts as to what is required to be the head of a marketing department were asked to rate the application or the fitness of somebody for a job. Some were given a resume of a woman, and it was indicated on it that she was a mother in some form or another. Other people were given the exact same resume, but it was not indicated if she was a mother or it said she was not a mother. When those resumes came back with notes, with the questions that people asked, do you think this person is qualified, competent? How much would you pay this person? Would you recommend this person for hire? The people that got the application with the mom, with the person who was the mom, said that she was less competent, worthy of less money, and were less likely to hire her than the people who got the application with the non-mom, even though they were the exact same application. When that same survey was done with men, and if somebody was a father or not, there was no meaningful difference. That's important in that study. That shows that discrimination or that extra burden that women go through or have in society. And that's part of what we talk about when we talk about the feminization of poverty and how women are more likely, especially single mothers, are more likely to be poor. It's not just that somehow being a single mother makes you, which is what a lot of people try and say, that single moms, let me back up and say this is a relation to that control of women's sexuality and how women's sexuality is seen as being important somehow in women's opportunities or women's capability of having a job or being properly employed, or how do I put this? Their decisions, women's sexuality is seen as whether or not they're making smart decisions, whether or not they have the moral fortitude, the self-discipline to do things. Now, a single mom is poor not necessarily because she doesn't have a man around to make money for her. She's not poor because she's a single mom. She's poor because she is faced with extra barriers that other people are not faced with in getting jobs and getting paid the same amount for jobs that other people, getting paid the same wage that even other women are paid for the same job. Is there a good example of this off the top of my head other than the study I just gave? Well, there's the framing issue that I do want to talk about. So I was given a sex ed curriculum book thing, the folder book thing that my cousin in 7th grade was given as part of her quote-unquote sex ed lesson, which was absence-only education, which I was fairly furious at and wrote a letter to my school to my former school, and tried to figure out why that was going on, why such a thing was being taught, because one of the things that it taught was that if you're a single mom, you're more likely to live a life of poverty. Technically true for the most part, but that's used as kind of a moral lesson to tell women not to be sluts, was what the lesson was there, at least implicitly. Wait until you're married, have a kid with your husband so your husband can get a job and you can stay at home with the kid. If you have a kid out of wedlock, you're a slut and you deserve to be poor. That was the message of that god-awful sex ed book. Okay? I was appropriately furious, I feel like, because I don't want my cousin to think that if she gets pregnant and chooses to have a child when she's not married, that she's a slut, or she's deserving for some reason of not having equal pay or anything. But part of the reason for that unequal pay, part of the reason why single mothers are not paid the same amount of money as mothers that are not single, that's right, as married women, or really part of the reason why single mothers are paid less than other women who are not mothers, is because of this bias that exists, maybe not even overtly in somebody's mind, but that makes people just naturally want to rate women who are mothers as less worthy of jobs and less worthy of pay than a woman who is not a mother, for example. Pause for a second and I'll be back. Alright, I'm going to talk some more, finish this up, and then do the study guide actually probably sometime tomorrow, depending on when I wake up. In the study guide will just be maybe going over a couple things explicitly, but maybe giving some code as to, well, not code, but direction as to things to look for and read, not necessarily giving you all the answers. Excuse me, jeez. Okay, so moms get paid less. Patriarchy. Okay, so the other thing that is important about like the politics of women's politics, cultural views towards women, how patriarchy is reinforced, the job sort of prospects, the job discrimination that women have, the problems they have getting jobs, things like that, not being over repetitive. There's another study in Delusions of Gender that highlights that in a couple different ways. There are lots of examples. In the job market, see if I can find them. I don't need to have it in front of me. Okay, yeah, page 60 though, I think it is. Manager of a construction company. Does it say anything else? Okay, so you can look at page 60 and see the study with regards to how people rated a candidate for a job at a construction company. Now, two applications were given to people. One was Sorry, hold on. Scratch my arm. Okay, 2 applications were given to prospective employers or whatever, or people who are in a position, and they were asked to rate the strongest candidate. One of the applications had somebody who had more education but less job experience. The other applicant had more job experience but less education. Now, in this case, the applications did not change, except for one thing. The gender of the person that was supposedly the owner of the resume or the application. So they gave some people an application for Michael, who had more education but less job experience, and an application for Kelly that had more job experience but less education. They gave other people the exact same 2 resumes, the exact same education, job experience on both of them, or whatever, you know. One had more education, one had more job experience, but switched the names so that now Kelly had more education and Michael had more job experience. What did they find? They found that Michael, the male job applicant, was always preferred for the job over Kelly, regardless of if he had more education experience or more work experience. When people looked at the application, they didn't ever say, well, Michael's going to get the job because he's Michael and is a man. But they said things like, let's say it was the application for Michael had more education and less job experience than Kelly. The people that looked at those applications would talk about how education was more important than experience, and that was what they were looking for, and that was the most important factor in their decision. When the opposite was true, the people got the opposite application, where Kelly had more education and Michael had more experience. They also chose Michael, and their justification was, well, you know, experience is really, really important in this job, and it outweighs the education that somebody gets, because, you know, education isn't necessarily a substitute for real-world experience. In neither of these cases did people say gender was a factor. And at least in my mind, and I think in the people who did the study's mind, none of these people that came back with the decisions that they made, that Michael was the most qualified candidate in both cases, did they think or consider that Michael was the best candidate because he was a man. It's not like these people were saying, I'm going to hire the man, and so I'm going to say whatever the man's qualifications are, that's what's needed for the job. Instead, this is an example of how this sort of gender bias works, patriarchy works, and how these gender differences work their way into every decision that we make and how we view and judge things, you know, different things, such as a job application. If you get a bunch of job applications, if a woman is strong in one area and a man is strong in the other area, more than likely, statistically, the area that the woman is strong in will be viewed as less valuable than the area that the man is strong in, and the man will get the higher. So while gender is not overtly in any way a reason people are making decisions based upon what's valuable or not, gender is without a doubt heavily influencing what people decide is important in job prospects and things like that and hiring people. So that's very important, and that's another part of the feminization of poverty, why it's hard for women to get jobs sometimes, why it's hard for them to get well-paying jobs, and why they get paid less. How this cycle of sexism can reproduce itself without realizing, without anybody sort of consciously making any decision to do so. It's the exact same thing with race. If you get a application that says Robert Eldridge versus an application that says shoot, I only ever call people by the last name, so I don't know what anybody in my class's last name is. Daquan Best, they're gonna hire me. Sorry. Why? Because of, more than likely, unconscious racism. Simply the name on the paper, the race of the individual, is going to make a difference in how the person who's reviewing the applications reads that application. I wish I remembered if it was in this book or something else that I was reading in preparation for this. I've read a couple of books and articles on this. If it was in the section I gave you, it all kind of blurs together. There was a woman who was applying for jobs on like monster.com, and she was and still is, as a matter of fact, a black woman, and she had a name that you would assume would be a black woman's name. She was not getting callbacks for jobs at all that she was applying to. She then, as a fun little experiment, decided to change the name on her application to something white sounding. Immediately, she started getting calls back for jobs that she applied to. The exact same resume, and sent that resume into the exact same jobs that she had sent the resume under in her real name. Got calls back for it. And not only that, but she was starting to get calls from people out of the blue for jobs she hadn't applied for. And these were also jobs that were not, the work from home BS, like sales rep jobs that everybody gets an email for. I've gotten lots of them, and they're, scams, kind of, or something. Anyway, so that sucks, right? Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, that's how that unconscious sexism and racism works at the job level also. Now, the one other important point with regards to gender and politics is how the justification for male superiority changes over time. Okay, and the second chapter that I gave you Sex and premature speculation. Get it? Premature. This chapter talks about the different scientific justifications that were given throughout the scientific revolution period, as to why women were inferior to men. For a while, it was the angle of the woman's face. However, that was decided to be dumb. And let's see, what was the next one? The next big idea was the ratio of skull length to skull breadth. And it was a way of measuring, or an indicator of mental capacity. But it was reluctant, and I'm reading out just from the book. It was reluctantly abandoned when it became clear that the head shapes of inferior social groups, including women, did not segregate neatly from those of superior groups. So, scientists and society at large was forced to abandon that because the data didn't hold. But that didn't mean that all of a sudden men and women were equal. The idea was, it's clear that women are inferior to men. We just got to find the right reason that'll stick. What was the next thing that she talks about? It was later believed that women's intellectual inferiority stemmed from their smaller and lighter brains. But that hypothesis was abandoned because it became unavoidably evident that despite somebody's brain size, they could be of much different intelligence. And I'm assuming probably they looked at men and saw that some men had very, very, very tiny brains and were very smart, and other men had very, very big brains and were very, very dumb. Maybe. So that was jettisoned. And then we moved on to neuroscience, which has its whole host of problems that she talks about. And one thing to remember when we're looking at modern justifications for why women are inferior or somehow inherently different than men is that no matter what era we're in, the science is always finding reasons for gender difference and sex inferiority, and always at this point a 100% failure rate at finding that. And during each of these times, the method at which people have gone about trying to show that has been seen as very, very advanced, like the most advanced, like, oh, we finally got it. This is like definitely the pinnacle of the way we need to be looking at these things. And it's always failed. That's not to say that this time it will fail, that somehow fMRI machines won't one day reveal something that maybe is some sort of inherent difference in terms of the mental capacities and innate some sort of innate difference in terms of nature versus or nurturing and caring and empathy and war making and stuff. But it's a reason to treat any claims with skepticism, in my opinion. That last part was my opinion. So that's the other important thing, and it fits to look at and remember, and it fits well with justifications for racism and justifications for patriarchy, and white male domination, is that the reasons always change, but the outcome stays the same and the conclusion stays the same. That white men are better than everybody else. If we look at race and racism, for a long time it was, the need for oppressing black people was that they were dumb and they were savage, and that they were somehow closer to, chimpanzees and gorillas than white people were, and they were better suited, this is justification for slavery, better suited for grunt work. And there were scientific studies that came out that showed that, and there was these part of the scientific ideas that black people were feeble-minded was justification for the slavery also, because if you're feeble-minded, you can't expect it to succeed in the world. So really, slave owners are just doing black people a favor, right? Because they're providing food, clothing, shelter, good honest day's work. And the corrective measures, the whippings, the rapes, the killings, the separating of families, all that disgusting stuff was necessary as part of the feeble-mindedness. Is like, how you would treat cattle. I don't know if you'd whip cattle, but like, how else are they going to learn the lesson? You've really got to treat them like children, but worse than that, because they're even less than white children. Because I assume you wouldn't, like, at least in the 1830s, you weren't chaining white children up, taking off their shirt and whipping them. It was a very disgusting and disturbing time. After the end of slavery, though, we moved from this idea of more explicitly, the black man as being this sort of feeble-minded child, helpless person, to the scientific information and this cultural belief that the black man was this aggressive, insane sex hound with a very large penis that was going to rape white women. And I mean literally, and I don't mean to say large penis to be vulgar or funny. I mean to represent the historical truth of the matter. And we have this very then long period of this scientific information talking about, one, also how black people are still dumber than white people and therefore can't do things, but also this change from the reason why we need to oppress black people and keep them down is not because they're these, dumb, bumbling idiots that can't, find their way out of a paper bag, but instead it's once they find their way out of the paper bag, they're going to go around raping white women all over the place, and we've got to protect them, white women. And so we need also, therefore, to have very harsh punishments against black men still, to discourage that, scientifically proven part of their nature. Recently, there's this started in the early 90s, where these terrible people who actually still have high-paying, high-profile jobs in conservative think tanks, like I think one of them is in it's either the American Enterprise Institute or the Heritage Foundation, and that guy is still writing papers and lashing out at people for thoroughly discrediting his work. So what they wrote a book called The Bell Curve, him and this one other guy, that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that black people were inferior to white people because they're dumber, because IQ tests show that black people are dumber by at least one standard deviation, which is a significant statistical measure. Also, they have cultural inferiorities that white people just don't have. Black people have cultural inferiorities that make them lazier, make them less, intelligent, make poor decisions. It's not white people's fault at all for anything. And so that's why, all couched in scientific, data-driven terms, but you can see through it pretty quickly to how racist and sexist, how racist that was, and how the data information was terribly flawed. But it got a lot of traction and a lot of very not smart, but prominent and important politicians and business leaders latched on to that, and used it, waved it around saying, look at how important this book is and how it proves that, black people are not good at things, and maybe not explicitly brought up, but this actual idea has been used for a lot of welfare reform, welfare to work type stuff, the war kind of on poverty, on black people, things like that. Let's see, I'm just taking a real quick look. Is anything important? People who hold up the bell curve as being important refer to themselves often as race realists. The ones that are not afraid to say the politically incorrect things, that black people are inferior to white people. Oh, he holds a job at the American Enterprise Institute. That's what it was. You should really look at it. It's ridiculous. Oh, and the co-author died before the book was published. Okay, that's it. But Charles Murray is the name of the guy who said the insane stuff. Holy crap. Andrew Sullivan apparently endorsed the bell curve, which is kind of a big deal. Anyway. Says that, and we've seen the same thing with gender. Women can't leave the home. Women can leave the home, but they're inferior and need to work only in domestic fields. And today, women don't get paid as much. One of the links on the PowerPoint is women don't get paid as much because they're not good negotiators, they're not aggressive enough. Women care about things other than work, like family and having babies, and so it's only natural that they get paid less. And that leads to this sort of cycle of poverty that women unfortunately run into. Oh, and then if you look at slide 20, I think there's that funny story about the examples of women that have transitioned to being male and how they've been treated differently at work, and how employers, without realizing that it's the same person, it's just that she transitioned to a he, will walk up to the he and say, "You're so much better than that woman we used to have working there," even though they're the exact same frickin' person. That's fun. I'll do this. I'm gonna hit the pause button real quick while I figure out how I want to do the sex and sexual violence stuff. 1 second.